Hi, so in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 3 of the Picture of Dorian Gray. It's interesting to note, I don't know if I didn't mention to every class, but the Picture of Dorian Gray was initially published in chapter installments, and then obviously all together once all the chapters were out. And this chapter was added in a later edition along with 5 other chapters. So the original narrative can stand without it, but I think you'll see once you have an analysis of it that it does include some really important information that helps enrich our knowledge of the character, specifically of Dorian at a later stage. Okay. So the setting is at the Albany where Lord Henry goes to visit his grandfather, his uncle, sorry, to gather information about Dorian's background, and then Lady Agatha's house. She's Henry's aunt, and they are there for a luncheon. And so the reason that Lord Henry has gone to visit his uncle is he needs he's trying to do like a sort of the 19th century version of stalking his Instagram and his Facebook to find out all about him. And then they attend a luncheon where we kind of get a nice feel for the social climate, and then we also get to see the increasing closeness of the relationship developing between Dorian and Lord Henry. Okay. So Henry wants to find out more about Dorian, which shows us his intense intrigue in this young man and his need to know as much about him as he possibly can. And so he learns that he is the last Lord Kelso's grandson. Okay. And his mother was a Devereux, Lady Margaret Devereux. And he says, I'm very much interested in Mr. Gray at present. I've only just met him, but I already am so obsessed with him. Read between the lines. So the first thing that he gets told is that his uncle was at her christening. Lady Devereux, she was an extraordinary, beautiful girl, made all the men frantic by running away with a penniless young fellow, a mere nobody. Scandal. He was just a foot soldier. And so interesting, very interesting that Dorian Gray's mother married somebody far below her. They a very wealthy family, and so and Dorian is a wealthy man in his own right because of his inheritance. So it would have been majorly scandalous for his mother to run away, of all things, not give permission to marry, but just run away and get married. And so what we find out is that even though it's not ever really confirmed, most people assume that Lord Kelso had his daughter's husband killed, and how he did that. The poor chap was killed in a duel at Spa a few months after the marriage. There was an ugly story about it. They said Kelso got some rascally adventurer, some Belgian brute, to insult his son-in-law in public, paid him so to do it, paid a guy to start a fight with this young soldier, and then the fellow spitted his man as if he'd been a pigeon, which is referring to when you put like a spit roast, like a lamb spit. So you run a sharp metal implement through an animal so you can turn it around. So of course that's a reference there to stabbing him through the middle as if he were a pigeon. The thing was hushed up, but Kelso ate his chop alone at the club for some time. In other words, people assumed that he'd done it and he was a social outcast for a while. He brought his daughter back with him, I was told, and she never spoke to him again. Well, why would you if your father had the love of your life killed? Obviously, because she's running away with a guy who's poor, she's running away. She's doing it for love, not for money. Okay. And then poor girl, died a year later and left Lord Kelso with Dorian. So Dorian, we know Dorian is an orphan. There's some scandal in his family history, and the later references to his grandfather being quite harsh to him might be, we don't ever find out exactly, but we can postulate that his grandfather would have perhaps had some resentment for Dorian, because he firstly is half of this man who he hated enough, or hated the idea of his daughter marrying enough to have killed. So he's got low blood in him, and he's also a reminder of his daughter who's now dead, and the scandal that came across his family. So the uncle says, if he's like his mother, he must be a good-looking chap. Oh, he's very good-looking, assented Lord Henry. He should have a pot of money waiting for him if Kelso did the right thing by him. His mother had money too. All the Selby property came to her through her grandfather. Her grandfather hated Kelso, thought him a mean dog. He was too. And then they also have there's a reference to stories about him treating people below him badly. So even his own father, so the previous Lord Kelso, his mother's grandfather, left all his money to the mother, which of course then would have gone to Dorian. So there's definitely this sort of spotty bad blood history of the family, but what comes out of it is that Dorian is incredibly wealthy. He's not of age yet. Okay, so he still has, his money would be in trust, but when he's of age, at 21, I would imagine, then he would have all of the money for himself. And so his uncle said his mother, Dorian said, oh, his mother was very beautiful, and she was one of the loveliest creatures I ever saw. What on earth induced her to behave as she did, I never could understand. She could have married anybody she chose. So it kind of tells you it's like there's a bit of free-spirited blood in Dorian, that his mother ran off with somebody for love, didn't marry for money, and obviously was very beautiful, could have had anyone she wanted. Okay, then Henry heads off to luncheon with Aunt Agatha, and before he does, his uncle says to him, tell her, oh, she's a good woman, but she thinks I've got nothing better to do than write checks for her silly fads. And I remember Aunt Agatha is a woman who involves herself with charity work. And Henry says, I'll tell her, but it won't have any effect, because philanthropic people who give to good causes, lose all sense of humanity. Now, obviously, he's contradicting himself there. And he later on in this chapter, he also talks about how he heartily disapproves of charity. I mean, really, just shows how out of touch he is in terms of his class and the suffering of others. He also says he can't bear the suffering of others. It makes him, it's distasteful. Sure. Then he is musing on the story of Dorian's parentage. Crudely as had been told to him, it stirred in him some suggestion of a strange, almost modern romance. Yes, it was an interesting background. It posed the lad, made him more perfect. Behind every exquisite thing, there was something tragic. So Dorian almost comes to represent this kind of romantic figure to him now, because he's got this interesting backstory. He's not just your average Joe. Then the rest of the references that I've pulled out of this chapter are either to do with Lord Henry and Dorian's burgeoning relationship. There's never any hint of anything more than a close friendship, by the way. And then also the chatter over the luncheon, which gives us some insight into the social climate and the way the people in Victorian England thought about things and behaved. So here Lord Henry is talking about how, and we've had this reference before, a sort of obtuse reference to him talking to Dorian was like playing upon an exquisite violin. He answered to every touch and thrill of the bow. There was something terribly enthralling in the exercise of influence. No other activity was like it. To project one's soul into some gracious form and let it tarry there for a moment. To hear one's own intellectual views echoed back to one with all the added music of passion and youth, to convey one's temperament into another as though it were a subtle fluid or strange perfume. There was a real joy in that, a satisfying joy. There was nothing that one could not do with him. He could be made a Titan or a toy. What a pity that such beauty was destined to fade. And here he's talking directly about the fact that he feels like he can just pluck and make little movements on Dorian as if he's a musical instrument for him to play the kind of music that he wants to play. So he feels very in control. This is feeding his ego, and he's really enjoying being able to project what he thinks about life into Dorian and then seeing how that plays out. It's kind of like what people, what parents do with their children. You project yourself into them, but this is a far more sort of forced and manipulative thing that he's doing. They have this brief little conversation. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but they talk about how there's this young woman. She's proposing to a man. How dreadful. Someone should interfere. And they say, yes, but she's American, and those Americans, they're a different sort. So we get this idea that they look down on Americans as sort of a more brash, classless bunch because they've left England and taken up in this new country. They're kind of these like rugged adventurers, and they've got all these newfangled thoughts about women and what they can do and what they shouldn't do, and they're traders and they have shops, and that's so vulgar to have to run your own shop. And they can see the very sort of high class snobbery going on there. Then Lady Agatha's talking here about the fact that Dorian's been persuaded by Lord Henry to give up in the East End because he used to play piano. Lord Henry said, I want him to play to me. Okay, so Lord Henry would rather have Dorian to himself, that he can play and enjoy his music, not that he has any shortage of pleasure in his life because he can, pay people to play for him. And so, but Lady Agatha says, but they're so unhappy in Whitechapel. It means so much, these people, to have some entertainment from, Dorian. And Lord Henry says, well, I can sympathize with everything except suffering. The less about life's sore, the better. So for Lord Henry, he'd rather not think about people suffering. He'd far more stay in his little bubble of comfort than think about those less fortunate to him. So that also, I think, gets some insight into the kind of personality is. And he quite openly shares these views at luncheon. And some people find him charming, and others, we don't really get their point of view. But I'm sure also a little bit shocked by what he says. Now, as he's talking to people, he can feel that Dorian's eyes are fixed on him, and the consciousness that amongst his audience there was one whose temperament he wished to fascinate seemed to give his wit keenness and lend colour his imagination. He was brilliant, fantastic, irresponsible. He's charmed his listeners out of themselves. Dorian Gray never took his gaze off him, but sat like one under a spell, smiles chasing each other over his lips, and wonder growing grave in his darkening eyes. So he's talking to everybody, but it's almost as if he's performing for that one special person, Dorian, who he knows is listening intently to what he's saying. And so at the end of this chapter, after Lord Henry's been told by some of his guests how scandalous his views are, although they do it in not like in a way that they are scolding him, but more like, oh, you're so funny, you say the most shocking things, Lord Henry. Oh my goodness. So Dorian says, did you mean everything you said at lunch? And Henry says, I quite forgot what I said. Was it all very bad? Very bad indeed. In fact, you're extremely dangerous, says Dorian. And if anything happens, we will all look at you as being irresponsible. But I should like to talk to you about life. Now, what this shows us is that Lord Henry doesn't even take what he says himself very seriously. He sort of says things for the sake of the shock value of them, which shows also his level of irresponsibility towards others and the kind of effect that he can have on them, because he says things that are scandalous, doesn't mean them, forgets all about them, and possible the effects and consequences it can have on other people. And so Dorian Gray says, please let me come with you to the park. Lord Henry says, but I thought that you'd promised Basil you would go with him. But Dorian says, no, I'd much rather go with you. Do you promise to talk to me all the time? No one talks as wonderfully as you. Lord Henry says he's tired of talking, but obviously I think he secretly wants to walk through the park and fill Dorian's head with all sorts of poisonous ideas. And so that's where we leave off on chapter 2, with this increased intensity of admiration between Dorian and Lord Henry, in anticipation of what that is going to bring forth in future. And poor old Basil left off on the side like Nigel, no friends.